The next topic is mutual exclusivity bias. Mutual exclusivity is a word learning constraint that involves the tendency to assign one label name and in turn avoid assigning a second label to a single object. Basically, this kind of bias, which is mutual exclusivity bias, refers to one-to-one relationship, which is there, one-to-one relationship a word has with the object, which means that one object can be labeled with one word or with one name. For example, cat cannot be a dog. Now, this is something which happens during the initial period of learning. Once the vocabulary grows, children's vocabulary expands, they come to know that there are different objects which can be referred to one categorical name, such as pet. For example, pet can be used for dog as well as for a cat. Now, this assumption is typically first seen in the early stages of word learning by toddlers, but it is not limited to young childhood. So we will now look at some of the points with regard to mutual exclusivity. We have seen that a child who knows the name of a particular object will then generally reject applying a second name to the object. Several experimental studies by Martman have supported the notion that children use mutual exclusivity in acquiring new words. Now, in 3-year-old children, it were presented with pairs of objects. One member of each pair was an object for which a child already had a label, such as a banana, toy cow or spoon, and the other was an object for which the child did not have a label. The children were then asked and they were found much more likely to select a novel object. A subsequent study presented children with novel labels for objects for which they already had labels, such as claw for hammer. Now, in this instance, the children interpreted the novel term as applying to only one part of the object. Now, another point to remember is that mutual exclusivity might influence the infant's decision about the reference of a new word. For example, if a child is faced with a familiar object for which they already have a label and an unfamiliar object which they have not yet labeled, they are likely to map a novel word onto the unfamiliar object. So this is called disambiguation effect. Next, the bias might cause an infant to change the extension of a familiar word. In this case, a child might remove wolf from their extension of dog upon hearing an animal labeled a wolf. This can be called the correction effect. As well, the bias might compel an infant to reject a new word, for instance, rejecting wolf in favor of dog. This is the rejection effect. Then we have mutual exclusivity, which might influence word generalization. In this case, if a child knows an object to have a particular name, the child should not generalize other names to it. So this is called restriction effect. Now we have the correction effect, we also have the rejection effect, and then restriction effect. Some studies have found positive correlations between children's use of mutual exclusivity and their learned vocabulary, while others have found the opposite. We have Colonen's and Sabach study on parents' facilitation of mutual exclusivity with their 12 to 24 months old, and they found that having parents who gave two labels for an object to their child was positively correlated with having a productive vocabulary. Then we have Halberta's study. He was one of the first studies to examine the limiting role of age on children's exhibition of mutual exclusivity. He found a linear relationship between age and performance, that is, the older the child, the more likely they were to use mutual exclusivity in word learning. Grouped by age 14 to 16 and 17 months old were tested in performing looking paradigm in which they were presented with a familiar object and novel object. They were asked to look at this process and were recorded based on which object they looked the longest. So the 17 months old looked at the novel object more than the original baseline preferences. The 16 months old looked at the rates no higher than the chance, and the 14 months actually looked at the familiar object after being asked this question. To conclude, considerable evidence suggests that constraints guide children's acquisition of lexical items. There is a continued debate regarding the best way to characterize these constraints, how to manage them, or how all these constraints can be fully explored to come up with the concrete findings which can address and answer all these constraints.